Welcome to The Fine Print, the podcast where we explore the law, its impact, and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Riddell, and on today's episode, I'm excited to welcome Mr. Ter Guo Ren, an aviation and transport lawyer at Australia's leading and aviation transport law firm, Norton White, advising on high-value aircraft trading, leasing, chartering, and complex commercial transactions across Australia, Europe, US, and Asia-Pacific. He launched his career in-house, driving major airport development and financing projects across 3 of Australia's top airports. He combines hands-on operational experience with transactional expertise to navigate some of the most challenging deals in aviation and transport sector. So to start us off, what initially drew you to aviation and transport law, and what keeps you interested in this field?
Firstly, thanks, Riddell, for having me on your lovely podcast. So I would say personally for me, one of the reasons why I was interested in the whole field of aviation and transport, well, I'm probably going to go a bit further if you don't mind, because as you have said, I started my career in-house. So after graduating from law school, I started my career as an in-house lawyer in the legal department of this aviation infrastructure management company that's based in Northern Australia. So this company essentially it operates 3 northern airports in Northern Australia, which are which is called the Darwin International Airport, Alice Springs Airport, and this other regional airport. So essentially, when I was there, my main work focuses on airport development projects and associated financing. And during then, obviously, that was my first foray into the whole aviation transport field, and I could really just appreciate the whole transport system works, essentially. You could see that, passengers flying in from airplanes, coming to the airports, and then you could see everything, how the whole aviation ecosystem, how it actually runs the whole economy, how it actually connects people to the world. And I think that was my first foray into how meaningful the kind of work is, at least to me. So when I was there, I was doing a lot of my main scope of work, involved a lot of obviously aviation infrastructure projects. And right before I left, I remember that I was actually involved in this very big airport project financing sort of work where we actually assisted in getting financing from many of the big syndicate banks around the world. I think that actually was the total consideration for that amount was probably in the order of like $900 million. And that essentially guarantees that we have enough funding for the airport's capital expansion plans for the next decade. When I was looking at that, I actually saw, the master plans with the necessary funding in place. I could see the necessary master plans in place for the whole airports, or rather for the whole company, their vision for all the airports. And obviously the main use for the amount of funding was for capital expansion, and obviously more specifically aviation. And it was from then that I realized that, wow, this aviation transport sort of work is actually pretty interesting. And it was also from there that I realized that, because obviously I was a pretty junior lawyer then, and that's when I realized that I should probably gain a bit more experience in private practice, which is usually the case. Generally, if you're a relatively junior lawyer, you should probably, I would say, try to gain a bit more experience, a few hard years, in private practice at a pretty decent firm, which I would like to think where I'm at now. So from there on, I moved to, obviously like where I'm currently at, which is Northern White, which is like a leading Australian boutique. I would say it's probably one of like the largest aviation and transport practice in Australia, and probably I would say in the whole of Asia Pacific. So from there, there really just grew my aviation experience, like my interest in aviation, and more broadly transport to another level, where my day-to-day work, I'm just dealing with like aircrafts and lots of and associated logistic matters around it. Then that's the reason why that's where I'm at now. And I would say that, after being in this whole aviation transport sectors for a couple of years, I would say that, this is the area which I really enjoy, and this is the area which I really do want to further my career in.
Thank you for sharing your journey and how this aspect of connecting people through transport and aviation law intrigued you to join the sector. So, turning to how aviation and transport law plays out in practice, what does your day-to-day work typically involve?
So I would say, I'm a transactional lawyer. I'm a full-on transactional commercial lawyer. So a big part of what I do day to day, especially at Northern White, is probably I wouldn't say it's totally different from what I did in-house. Because when I did in-house, like I've said previously, most of my work revolves around airport development projects, and including looking at hangar leases, airport leases, essentially with aviation infrastructure and project financing. But obviously, when I'm at in-house, most of my work actually involves around the buying, selling, leasing, chartering of aircrafts and associated assets. And with that, it also encompasses general corporate and commercial work in the aviation and logistics sector. So essentially, like my practice area, I focus mainly on aviation work, but I also do more of like the broader transport and logistics sort of work. So my day honestly varies. Right before I went on break, because in Australia, where I'm currently based at, the last week of December and the first week of January is, like most major corporates in Australia, you go on like a long-term break for like 2 weeks before commencing work in the second week of January. Mm-hmm. So right before then, I was actually finishing up like an aircraft purchase transaction, and the week before, I was actually closing like a transport M&A deal. Mm. Yeah, so I would say day to day really, really varies. Mm. And I think like in between the transport M&A deal and the aircraft trading, like the aircraft purchase transaction, I was actually negotiating like a finance lease for a heavy machinery asset for one of our airline customers. So it really depends. But most of the time, like I say, lease, purchase, associated corporate commercial sort of work. So that's what keeps it interesting.
That breakdown gives us a clear picture of how varied and kind of commercially driven this work can be. So for listeners who may not be too familiar with the business side of aviation, how does leasing an aircraft differ from purchasing one outright?
I would say, from a very layman point of view, the whole notion of leasing and purchase, essentially, if you think about it, it's pretty similar to actually leasing and buying a property. So in terms of leasing, if you were to think about it, leasing is the same thing as like renting a property, and the property being an aircraft. So let's say if you say, I want to lease an aircraft, or like you want to buy an aircraft, obviously the main thing is title. The same thing for, if you want to if you want to rent a property, or if you want to buy a property, the main thing is that, if you rent a property, you get possession of it, but you don't have title of it. But obviously, if you were to talk about it in an aircraft sort of sense, the agreements might be a bit different, even though many of the notions might be similar under aircraft lease. And again, like not to go into too much legal jargon, but there's also different kinds of leases. Mm-hmm. There could be something called an operational lease, where it's just the bare leasing of the aircraft itself. Or it could be like without any sort of terms or without any sort of rights to purchase after that. Or it could be the other way, which is a finance lease, mm-hmm. which essentially means that you lease the aircraft, but at the end of the lease term, you have the option to buy it. Most of the time it's structured such that it is an option to purchase transaction. So these two, are pretty, which are the most common kinds of lease structuring in terms of asset finance transactions. And obviously with buying, you'll be under like an aircraft purchase agreement where, parties negotiate the terms, what kind of laws, what kind of representation warranties, delivery conditions, and the whatnots. And depending on what governing law do the parties want, it comes, it really it really depends. But most of the time, the main provisions, whether it's like Australian law, English law, or American law, or Singaporean law, that could really depend in terms of what kind of governing law it is. That could really depend on the kind of how the contract is like, and same for leasing contracts as well. Even though, from what I could see, or rather like what I have come across, most of the contracts which I've seen for aviation and leasing sort of contracts are usually under like American and English sort of law, more of American law. But, yeah, so essentially, the main thing is, sorry, I'm digressing, but the main thing I would say is probably title and how contracts are being structured, how you review clauses around it. The main thing is title.
That distinction really underscores the financial and legal complexities behind aviation transactions and leasing and buying one and the differences between them. So building on that transactional complexity, how does advising on transactions that span multiple jurisdictions shape the way you structure and negotiate deals?
Say that's a pretty interesting one. The whole notion of, I would say, in terms of aviation asset transactions, financing, I would say that's one of the beauties, or at least something which I view that which keeps me interesting, is how international it is. For instance, the recent aircraft purchase that I was working on, it's actually governed under American law. The buyers were from the US. Our clients, the purchasers, were actually based in Ireland. And the delivery, where our buyers are looking to collect the aircraft, was actually in Singapore. And and we are actually Australian lawyers. So it's you could just see that the complexity of how structuring these sort of aircraft deals are like, given the international nature of it. Yeah. So, and the thing is that even if one of the reasons why many aircraft transactions are actually closed in Singapore, it's actually because of Singapore, they have zero export taxes if your aircraft is just for a couple of days. Generally, I'm not a tax advisor, but generally, these are how aircrafts are done. Like, many aircraft transactions are structured in that sense. So I would say, different countries obviously have different laws, but at the end of the day, in terms of for aircraft purchase or aircraft sale transactions, they are, or aircraft leasing transactions, in a way, all of them, even if it's under English law, if it's under American law, or if it's under, it could be under Singaporean law, Australian law. I think generally, for common law, if it's the governing law, it's of a common law countries sort of governing law, like the countries which I've mentioned, they are actually structured pretty similarly, because a lot of aircraft transactions, they are structured around the same, because the way in which it's being worked, the way in which risks are identified, it's pretty similar. The way lawyers are pretty similar. But I would say something which might be a bit different could be, for instance, signing in terms of execution requirements. Yeah, for instance, in Australia, under the Companies Act, you will require 2 directors to sign. Might be the same thing for Singapore. In the US, as I'll probably say the UK as well. In the US, generally, you probably need an American lawyer to confirm what I've said, because I'm not American qualified. But I would say generally you require 2 directors as well. So so aside from that, in terms of execution formalities, another aspect is also in terms of where do you want the aircraft to be registered. Like, for instance, if it's an Australian buyer and you're buying an aircraft from the US, you would need to get it deregistered in America, and then you get it registered in Australia. So, and that's where people hire lawyers to do that. And so I would say the way in which contracts are being handled, are being negotiated, are pretty much the same across jurisdiction, especially if the governing law is American law, English law, Australian law, Singaporean law, etc. But you would still have to be mindful of, and it's probably better to have a lawyer that's based in the relevant country to ascertain that, in terms of registration requirements, execution requirements, filing of security interests, which actually, in Australia, there's something called a personal property security register, where you could register certain security interests to ensure that you have a charge over the relevant aircraft. Obviously, for aircraft transactions, there's something called the International Registry, which is under the Cape Town Convention. But aside from this sort of other formalities, I would say the way in which you govern it is pretty much the same. That's how international aviation financing is.
I can definitely see how working across borders adds more complexity in terms of registration and these other kinds of issues that lawyers need to tackle, but rather the governing body themselves are quite similar.
Yep, exactly.
So taking that cross-border element a bit further, how do cultural differences affect contract negotiations in practice?
I would say that that's a good one, and I would say I'll probably be able to talk a bit more about it coming from the fact that technically I am a born and bred Singaporean who's currently based in Australia. So I've only really been working as a lawyer in Australia, and what I could speak from my times of working in Singapore was during the time when I was an intern during university holidays while I was working in Singaporean law firms. Yep. I would say something which I realized was that, for one, in Singapore, there's really no, and again, I say this based on, purely on the basis which was what I realized, and not that I'm not saying which countries practice is better, but I would say in Singapore, there's lesser of a fine line between personal life and your working life. So for instance, I could, like when I was working at a Singaporean law firm, after work, my colleagues would expect me to, or like rather my superiors would ask me like, do you want to go for like drinks, or do you want to hang out like sometimes like even like during the weekends or something? And there's less of a fine line, and most of the people whom I work with, a lot of times we became friends. Like even during like lunch, like in Singapore, everyone goes out for lunch, as you could see from the huge crowd in like Singapore CBDs during working hours. Whereas in Australia, it's somehow similar as well, but I would say there's more of a fine line between everyone respects your personal life in Australia. And what I meant by that was that most of the time people in Australia, there's no like a group lunch culture, if I have to put it correctly, such that everyone goes for lunch like on their own accord. Most of the time, at least for me, I would just buy like a simple like sandwich or like a kebab or something, and go back to my office and plow back through my day-to-day work. And this is the case for like, not just because I'm trying to be antisocial, but it's just because that's just the way it is. I mean, we do have like obviously team lunches, but those are usually scheduled like a few days in advance, which because Australians, they do respect the fact that your lunchtime is your own paid time away from work, where you should do like what you want, if that makes sense, compared to in Singapore. Provided that like they treat you as a power team, usually they will invite you to like go for team lunch and those sort of things. Like most days of the week, I won't say they expect, but they think it's a given that everyone goes for lunches in one whole big groups. Which is not the case in Australia. Even for Australia, like if you do, I mean, we do have like work drinks pretty often. I might say a bit too often, like sometimes, but if we do want to, let's say like hang out after work or something, usually that does happen, but I would say it's probably not as prevalent as Singapore. So this, I would say, for one, I mean, there's many other things which I could go on for the next couple of hours to say the differences and which one I think is better, but I think for one, this is probably the most apparent point which I saw, like between working in the two countries.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's just like a work-life balance difference. Yeah. And again, as you mentioned, it's just like a difference between cultures, and that's just something that comes like, with being in a new country, being in a new environment.
Exactly. Yep.
So with that in mind, how did COVID-19 affect the aviation and transport law industry?
I will probably say, as a disclaimer, in COVID-19, I was still a pretty junior graduate lawyer, but I gotta say, I mean, obviously they have ripple effects, for like years to come in terms, and obviously, like right now, airlines and all, we are still like, I won't say recovering, but we are still seeing the effects of the COVID-19 effects, like from a couple of years back. So what I would say in terms of COVID-19, obviously during COVID-19, I mean, I wasn't there, but what I could see was that, obviously borders were shut. Many international borders were shut or severely limited in terms of what you could do. And obviously with that, it comes with lesser transactions might be going on. But what happened was that post-COVID, as what you could see, air travel demand has skyrocketed. And obviously with that, it comes on with a lot more aircraft transactions, happening. With more aircraft transactions, I mean, in terms of leasing, big lessors are looking to lease aircraft to airlines or lessees. Aircraft trading activities going on. People are looking to buy aircraft, sell aircraft for many of their corporate endeavors. There's such a lot more airline activities going on, obviously, which comes with more air travel demand. So that's one. I mean, that's probably on the commercial side. But secondly, with that also, like probably from a aviation liability sort of standpoint, again, like I don't really do many of the aviation litigation sort of work, but obviously with that, it comes with a bit more when you're drafting, like, for instance, like recently I drafted like a conditions of carriage, which is like sort of like a charter agreement for like one of our airline companies. So like general commercial aviation sort of work, and something which you could see this, like in terms of how you have to draft, you have to take reference to certain, because obviously how aircraft contracts are like, you have to reference to a lot of the other international conventions. So for instance, like one which talks about in terms of checked baggage or injuries, this sort of things, in terms of ticketing liabilities, in terms of, for instance, when passengers, when they lost their baggage, what if they suffer injury during aircraft. Many of all these positions, I would say contractual positions, in terms of how much you can claim, how long should you take to bring an action, like the time limitation in terms of how long you have to take action, they are all usually stated in the Montreal Conventions, which is this international convention called Montreal Convention, which Australia is a signatory to, and I believe Singapore is as well. In terms of, and the reason why I talk about this was that there has been a lot more cases, obviously with the surge in like air demand. There's going to be more passengers traveling. More passengers taking flights, and with more passengers taking flights, obviously there's going to be more liability for this sort of dispute to arise. In terms of how, like with more aircraft volumes, more flights going on, more flights volume going on, there's going to be more instances like this. So in terms of the way in which we draft sort of conditions of carriage charter agreements for our clients, you also got something which I realized that like clients are usually a bit more particular about in terms of the kind of positions in which we should allow for. I believe one of our clients, it's a big charter company. One of our clients, we actually had to advise him that, because he was really quite strict in terms of the time limitation for passengers to bring actions against them. And the thing is that what he didn't realize was that the Montreal Convention actually states a certain amount of period, and we have to adhere to that. Because obviously that's the law, and Australia is signatory to it. But what they were saying is that, after COVID, because there has been a lot more resurgence in terms of passengers trying to bring actions against them, in terms for their checked baggage or in terms of any sort of apparent injury or those sort of things. So this is something which I realized that clients are usually a bit more particular about the kind of liability which they could incur. And probably, it's just a ripple effect of the increasing air demand.
Yeah, I definitely think that with COVID, I think everyone knows that there was such a surge of demand in flights and vacation and stuff like that after the whole pandemic was over. And it definitely puts a lot more pressure on aviation lawyers like yourself, to handle more kind of leases and just more negotiations overall.
Because clients are definitely a bit more careful nowadays in terms of looking at what's stated in the contract itself, whereas before COVID, they might be like, okay, that seems about right, something like that.
Yeah, I think that just shows how much more liability people have in general, and how everyone is just a bit more informed about this subject. Yeah. So on that note, how do international treaties or conventions affect the contracts you draft?
So I think I've touched on that a little bit when talking about the Montreal Convention, but let me just, since we're on this topic, let me just dive in a bit more, because obviously how conventions work, For one, there's the Montreal Conventions, which a lot of aviation litigation lawyers work with. For transactional lawyers like myself, we work a lot with like the Cape Town Convention, which is essentially the main registry which registers all the international aircraft in terms of their security interests, whether it's been leased, whether it's been sold, whether it's their existing interest from a lessor or like from a bank. That's the main register which is stated inside the Cape Town Convention. So I would say, as long as your country is a signatory to the convention, which obviously Australia is, I'm pretty sure Singapore is as well, and obviously like US and UK and obviously the world largest leasing hub, Ireland, they're also like a signatory to the. Those are the top of my head in terms of the countries which are signatory to the Cape Town Convention. So if your country is a signatory to this sort of conventions, obviously you have to adhere to what the position stated inside this sort of conventions. And I would say this is probably one of like the beauty of like being an aviation lawyer. You could be based in like for instance Australia, and like I say, you're often advising on matters in the US. Like I would say that an aviation lawyer that's based in Australia is probably doing the same thing as an aviation lawyer that's based in the US, and same thing, an aviation lawyer that's based in Singapore is probably doing the same thing as an aviation lawyer that's based in the UK or the US or in Australia. I mean, assuming that they're all like Commonwealth countries, the way in which international conventions are, because it operates in many of all these countries, it's not like a local sort of regulation that's just tied on one country. It essentially just make the whole notion of aviation financing international. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a very valuable perspective. And of course, international treaties and conventions are international in its nature.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's really nice to see more awareness again on this subject, and lawyers also having this awareness and knowing that international conventions apply to not just one country, but as you mentioned, a lot of other countries, for example, Commonwealth countries, or all kind of share the same kind of legal jurisdictions and formats under international conventions.
But, I mean, so long as your country is a signatory to such conventions.
So looking at a more personal side of your job, what's the most exciting part of your job that people outside this field might not expect?
I've already touched on this, but let me delve more into this again. Personally, for me, and again, I can't speak for everyone who's in this sector, I'll say probably for me is firstly how international my work is. I'm constantly working on matters, aircraft that is registered in the US, but delivering from the US or from England. I've worked on matters in Indonesia, in Papua New Guinea, in Singapore, obviously, in Australia, in the UK, in Ireland. Essentially, this is something which I personally really like. The fact that it's so international. If you're someone who enjoys cross-border work, you like to think that your practice, is an international sort of practice. You like to look at practice beyond where you're based at. This practice area will be quite a good fit. A lot of times it forces you to put on like your thinking has such that, wow, okay, so this law is governed under American law, but I'm an Australian lawyer. I mean, how do I obviously, I mean, like the people who are best catered to draft these sort of things are obviously American lawyers, but the thing is that if our clients are Australian clients and the aircraft is currently we are buying it from like a American owner, chances are the lawyers that he will use would be from America. So at the same time, like being an aviation lawyer that's based in Australia, you still have to act the best way for your client while telling them that, hey, look, I'm not a US qualified, but I think I'm an aviation lawyer, and a way in which such that aviation law works is that it's international. So we could convince them that we are well qualified to advise on this sort of contracts. So that's one thing, the way in which how international aviation transport law is. I'll say secondly for me is, I would say probably aircraft, in terms of if I were to work on aircraft and transport more broadly, is probably you could really see the tangible effects of what you have done. Sometimes, I was working on, my team and I were working on a matter for Qantas a couple of months back. And then we usually go for our end of financial year dinner, year-end dinner, because our headquarters, I'm based in Melbourne, but our company's, the head office is in Sydney. So when we were taking like our flights, then we were passing through the passenger terminal, we saw one of the aircrafts there. We're like, hey, didn't we work on that aircraft? In terms of, so you could just see that, it's a very tangible sort of practice area, such that you could see the effects of, I won't say effects, but you could see the work that you have done, in place. I mean, probably it was the right place at the right time, like we were just passing through, but you could just see this sort of things. And I think personally that's something which I find very satisfying. Yeah.
That really explains why you were drawn to this field, having this global aspect and seeing the effects of your work. I think they're just two important things. And as well as, with globalization, the world becoming more interconnected, I think your international aspect really shines through and is really prevalent. So finally, what advice would you give to aspiring lawyers wanting to enter these fields of law?
I would say, obviously, firstly, have a law degree, be a lawyer. Obviously that's a given. But in terms of if you do want to be an aviation lawyer, I would say first thing it's you got to be someone who is okay to be comfortable foraying into uncharted territory. Because I would say, at least for me, when I started in this practice area, I was a bit intimidated by the fact that my counterparties are actually based on the other side of the world, or actually based in Europe, or those sort of things. Because for instance, if you might just be, if you're like a corporate lawyer, if you're an M&A lawyer, at least in Australia, a lot of times deals might be domestic, and let's say if you're acting for the buyer, the seller lawyers might just be like 2 blocks away from you. It's easy. You might even know the person. You might have gone for even drinks or have a burger with the person at some point. Whereas for aviation, in terms of for aviation lawyers, most of the time is that given that it's so international, I would say it's quite unlikely that the other party is located in the same country, in the same country, or let alone in the same continent as you. So I would say you got to be comfortable with, at the start, advising on something which you think it's be a bit of an uncharted territory. And I would say secondly, aside from that's one thing. Essentially, comfortable with that. Secondly, you got to be okay with working sometimes out of your usual 9 to 5. Yeah, because obviously with that, just continuing on from the first point, if you're based in Australia, but your client is but the other party is based in the US, obviously there's a huge difference in time zone. So sometimes you gotta be in a meeting in the wee hours of the morning. I remember that when I was doing a asset disposal transaction, one of my the other parties who were also based in the US, they wanted to have a call with us ASAP because we were looking to close. That happened towards the middle of this year, if I remember correctly, because obviously companies were looking to clean up their books in the in the end of financial year, which usually happens in June or July of every year in Australia. And I remember that because we were working on quite a tight timeline, and they wanted to have a call with us. I think it was, if I remember correctly, I can't remember what time would it be in the US, but it would be 6:30 a.m. our time, which I think it might be 6:30 in the US or in New York or something, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, but I just remember that it's around 6 or 7 a.m. during our time, and so you got to be comfortable with doing these sort of things. Personally, for me, I felt that there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of adrenaline. The fact that I'm doing this sort of things, but some lawyers might not be comfortable with the again. So and personally, I would say lastly, in terms of aviation, I mean, it's just gonna be cliche. You gotta have interest for it. In terms of how airports work, in terms of how aircrafts are. Because at the end of the day, aircrafts are a high value asset. It costs a lot of money, and A lot of times, like in aviation law, it's not just buying of aircraft itself. There's a whole, the whole ecosystem encompassing it. You have the airports, the aircraft, and you have a general, like, sort of like corporate and commercial sort of work. So there's a lot of work which goes on into like a aircraft transactions. I wouldn't say that it's super difficult, but I would say at the same time, you've got to have a lot of motivation in trying to pull through like an aircraft deals, because there's a lot of times it's not just like an aircraft sale and purchase agreement or aircraft leasing agreement. There's a lot of background work which goes behind it. So you've got to have passion for like the aviation industry in general, because it can be a bit, there's not many I would say aviation and transport lawyers globally, as you could tell. So I would say, it's a pretty small knit community, and most people who are inside, as I could see, they do have a passion for like the aviation sector.
That's very practical advice. And again, I think your international aspect does shine through again. Like, I think it just shows that you have to be interested in this international field, as well as having passion, as you mentioned, for the sector itself, not just law, but actually aviation and transport. So thank you for your time, Mr. Ter. And to all my listeners, court is now adjourned. Until next time with the fine print.